There's a moment you might know all too well. You're in a conversation, and someone says something that hurts, diminishes you, or just dismisses you in a way that cuts deep. You feel that internal pressure rising, that almost physical urge to respond, to defend yourself, to prove something. And often you speak. Maybe you speak too much. Maybe you say things you didn't mean to. Or perhaps you stay silent. But it's a tense silence, brimming with resentment while inside you're falling apart. Afterward, when you're alone, when the noise of the situation finally dies down, you're left with that bitter feeling that you lost something. Not necessarily the argument, something deeper. It's as if you handed over a part of yourself you shouldn't have. You feel like the words that came out, or the ones that stayed stuck in your throat like poison, weren't really yours. They were reactions. They were automatic responses, triggered by pain, by fear, by the need for approval or control. And the next day, you wake up with this weight, this feeling that you exist in a way you didn't choose, that the circumstances around you are shaping you more than you'd like to admit. This isn't weakness. This is the human condition lived without a tool that very few discover. And this tool isn't a communication technique. It's not a rhetorical trick. It's not some list of phrases to sound smarter in an argument. It's something far more radical and far more profound. It's the understanding that between what happens to you and your response, there exists a space. And in that space resides everything that you truly are. Viktor Frankl, an Austrian psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz, discovered this not in a library, not in a comfortable office, but in the most brutal place humanity has ever created. An environment where everything a human being possesses had been systematically destroyed. Family, name, possessions, physical dignity, a visible future, everything. And yet, in the midst of this total destruction, Frankl found something that couldn't be taken away. And this something has everything to do with the silence we're going to talk about today. A silence that isn't passivity, isn't cowardice, isn't resignation, but is perhaps the most powerful form of freedom a human being can exercise. To understand why silence can be someone's greatest power, we first need to understand what Frankl observed about human nature in a context where that nature was pushed to its absolute extreme. In the concentration camps, there were prisoners who behaved in completely different ways when faced with the same terrible conditions. Frankl described this with chilling clinical precision. There were those who became brutal, who surrendered completely to the environment, who stole from their fellow prisoners, who prostituted themselves in every imaginable way for an extra crust of bread, who became, in a sense, extensions of the destructive mechanism around them. And there were others, a significant minority who, even while losing everything, even under extreme hunger, disease, systematic humiliation, and constant threat of death, maintained a quality of being that the environment couldn't fully touch. Frankl saw prisoners who shared their last slice of bread. He saw people who comforted others in the gas chambers, who maintained an inner stance of dignity, even when all external dignity had been violently stripped away. And he asked himself, what explains this difference? If we are merely products of our environment, if we are determined by our biological and psychological circumstances, how do we explain that people in the same objective circumstances respond in such radically different ways? The answer Frankl developed changed psychology forever. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies the freedom of the human being to choose their response. And in that response lie their growth and their happiness. This phrase, which circulates widely online, often without proper attribution, encapsulates the heart of logotherapy, the psychological school Frankl founded. And it has a direct and profound connection to the power of silence. Because true silence, conscious silence, silence that is a choice and not an omission, is precisely the active exercise of that space between stimulus and response. When someone provokes you and you react immediately, you have eliminated that space. You have become an automatic response machine, determined by the external stimulus. When you choose silence, you are asserting, sometimes more powerfully than any word could, that there is a being here that is not simply the product of its circumstances, that there is someone capable of pausing, of observing, of choosing. And now I want to pause here and really talk with you, because I know that many of you watching this video have been through situations where you felt you lost that space, where you reacted in ways you later regretted, where the internal and external noise was so great that there was no room to be who you truly want to be. Tell me in the comments here, have you ever found yourself in a situation where you fell silent not by choice, but because you didn't know what to say, and later discovered that accidental silence was more powerful than any response you could have given? Or on the contrary, Did you speak when you shouldn't have and still carry the weight of it today? If you identify with this tension between speaking and being silent, write in the comments simply, "I'm still learning to choose my silence. Nothing more is needed." And by writing that, you are doing something important. You're acknowledging that there is a path, that there is something to learn, and that openness is itself an act of courage. Many people here are on the same journey, and seeing that others are also seeking this inner freedom might be exactly what someone needed to see today, to not give up on themselves. Your presence here matters more than you imagine. Frankl didn't develop his ideas about inner freedom as an abstract intellectual exercise. He developed them while carrying heavy stones in the cold, while watching comrades die of exhaustion beside him, while being treated as less than human by guards who had been taught to see him not as a person, but as a problem to be eliminated. And it was in that context that he made a discovery that seems paradoxical at first glance. The more extreme the loss of external freedom, the clearer became the possibility of internal freedom. Not because life in the camp was good, not because suffering was desirable, but because when you strip everything away from a person, what remains, if anything still remains, is the irreducible core of who they are. And Frankl discovered that this core is not passive. It can be exercised, it can be cultivated. It can be the point from which a person reconstructs not only their sanity, but their meaning. Silence as power. In the way Viktor Frankl helps us understand it, isn't the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It's not the silence of fear, of someone who stays quiet because they don't feel capable or worthy of speaking. It's not the manipulative silence of someone who uses the absence of words as punishment or control. These silences exist, they are common, and in fact, they reveal an absence of inner freedom, not its presence. The silence Frankl allows us to speak of is the silence of self-distancing, a central concept in his work. Self-distancing is the uniquely human capacity to step away from ourselves, to observe our own internal processes as a separate observer, to not be completely identified with our impulses, fears, pains, and automatic reactions. It's what allows a human being in a concentration camp to observe their own hunger and say, "I am hungry, but I am not just this hunger." It's what allows someone in a heated argument to observe their own anger and say, "I am angry, but I don't have to be this anger right now." This concept goes far beyond simple emotional management you find in any emotional intelligence course. Frankl is talking about something deeper, the noetic dimension of human existence. The noetic dimension, from the Greek nous, meaning mind or spirit, is what Frankl identified as the deepest layer of a human being, the one that cannot be completely determined by biology, psychology, or environment. It's the dimension where the freedom of choice resides, the capacity to take a stance towards oneself, the possibility of transcending given conditions and responding to them from a place that is not simply determined by them. And conscious silence is one of the clearest expressions of this dimension. When you choose not to react, when you choose to pause before responding, when you choose to inhabit the space between stimulus and response instead of collapsing it, you are exercising your noetic dimension. You are being more than a set of conditioned reflexes. Let's think about how this manifests in contemporary life, because it's very easy to talk about these ideas abstractly. But Frankl was above all a clinician, someone deeply interested in how these truths apply in the real lives of real people. Think about the most important relationships in your life, your family, your close friends, your romantic partners, your colleagues. How many times have conflicts that could have been small become big, precisely because someone, you or the other person, reacted immediately without inhabiting that space between stimulus and response? How many conversations that could have been moments of real connection have become ego battles precisely because no one was willing to exercise the power of silence, to implicitly say through the pause, "I care about this more than being right now," Frankl observed in his patients, both before and after the war, in his clinical practice in Vienna. That much of the psychological suffering we encounter in relationships comes precisely from this inability to inhabit that space, this tendency to become reaction machines determined by what the other person does or doesn't do. There was a patient of Frankl's, a middle-aged man who came to his office deeply depressed after the death of his wife. The man loved the woman with a rare intensity, and the loss had simply taken the ground out from under his feet. Frankl could have tried to convince him that he would overcome the pain, that time heals all wounds, that he would find new meaning in the future, the usual consolations that generally console no one. Instead, Frankl asked a question. He asked the man what would have happened if he had died first, if his wife were alive and he were not. The man was silent for a moment, and then said it would have been terrible for her, that she would have suffered immensely. And Frankl said something that stuck. By dying before you, she was spared that suffering. And this suffering that you carry now, you are carrying it for her. The man's suffering didn't change. The loss didn't diminish. But his relationship with that suffering transformed completely. He saw that even in the most intense pain, there was a form of meaning. There was a choice about how to inhabit that pain. That is the power of a different inner stance. And the silence Frankl used before responding, the pause he created before offering that perspective, was as important as the words that followed. If these ideas are touching something deep in you, if you feel like someone is finally talking about something you always intuited but never knew how to name, subscribe to this channel. Here we explore Frankl's thought and that of other humanist philosophers weekly, offering real answers to the deepest questions we carry. We are not a superficial self-help channel, not a motivation channel that gets you fired up for 24 hours and then everything goes back to normal. We are a space for people who want to go deep, who want to understand not just how to feel better, but how to live with more authenticity, more inner freedom, more real meaning. If you are on this quest, you don't have to be alone in it. Click the subscribe button, activate the notification bell, and let's explore together these depths that very few channels in Portuguese are willing to inhabit with the seriousness and care they deserve. The issue of silence necessarily leads us to one of the most fundamental tensions Frankl identified in the modern human condition: the tension between the will to meaning and the will to approval. We live in an era of unprecedented noise. Social media has created an environment where silence seems impossible, where not responding is interpreted as weakness, where visibility has become a value in itself, where the quantity of words we produce seems to measure our worth. And Frankl, though he didn't live through the social media era, diagnosed decades in advance the sickness they would amplify, what he called the existential vacuum. The existential vacuum is the widespread feeling of meaninglessness, that nothing truly matters in a deep way, which paradoxically manifests in an excess of activity, consumption, stimulation. When we don't know what we want, when the deep meaning of life escapes us, we try to fill the void with noise, with opinions, with reactions, with the constant need to position ourselves to be seen, to prove we exist through the sheer volume of our verbal presence. Genuine silence threatens this escape strategy, and that's why it's so difficult. When you stay quiet in a heated discussion, when you don't take the bait from a provocation, when you let an argument hang without the last word, you often face not just internal discomfort, but external misunderstanding. Those around might interpret that silence as submission, as a lack of arguments, as weakness. And that interpretation stings, because we're relational beings who crave recognition. Frankl understood this deeply. He wasn't naive about the challenges of living by inner principles in a society that often rewards loudness and punishes reflection. But he also knew, with the authority of someone who tested these ideas under the most extreme conditions imaginable, that external approval can never replace inner meaning. That the person who chooses to be silent, who acts from internal values rather than external reactions, carries a form of dignity that doesn't need others' validation to be real. This leads us to a crucial distinction Frankl makes, one rarely discussed with enough depth: the difference between silence as an expression of freedom and silence as an expression of repression. Because there's a silence that sickens. There's the silence of someone swallowing their emotions, not by choice but from an inability to express them, out of fear of consequences, from a learned pattern that their feelings don't matter or are dangerous to voice. There's the silence of someone systematically taught that staying quiet is the only way to survive. This silence isn't power. This silence is a prison. And Frankl, as a psychiatrist, knew how to distinguish the two. Healthy silence, the silence that is power, emerges from a place of inner sufficiency. It emerges when you are silent, not because you have no voice, but because your voice is so present within you that you don't need to prove yourself to the world at every moment. It's the silence of someone who knows their worth, not someone who doesn't know what they want. It's the silence of someone who has something so important to say that they carefully choose the moment and the way to say it, not someone who has nothing to offer. Frankl developed a therapeutic technique called paradoxical intention that illustrates this principle in a fascinating way. Paradoxical intention involves asking a patient to intend or to wish for precisely what they fear. A patient with insomnia might be instructed to try to stay awake for as long as possible. A patient with social anxiety might be told to try to sweat as much as possible in their next social situation. What seems contradictory has profound logic. by voluntarily approaching what you fear, by choosing to intentionally inhabit the space you want to flee from, the patient breaks the cycle of anxious hyperfocus and discovers they have more control than they thought. And there's a direct application of this principle to the power of silence. Instead of trying not to react, which often only increases internal tension, you intentionally practice inhabiting the silence. You consciously step into that space between stimulus and response, not as a minefield to be crossed quickly, but as a territory you are learning to know and inhabit with growing comfort. In practice, this means, among other things, learning to tolerate the discomfort of the pause. When someone says something that provokes you, there's an immediate physical discomfort. Your chest tightens, your breathing changes, your hands might tremble slightly, your heart races. The automatic reaction serves precisely to alleviate this discomfort with the release of an immediate response. But Frankl teaches us that the discomfort itself isn't the enemy. It's part of healthy existential tension, what he calls the tension between what we are and what we could be, between our current state and the meaning we seek. Learning to inhabit that discomfort without collapsing into it, learning to feel the pressure to react and still choose the pause, is an exercise in freedom that becomes easier with practice, but never becomes completely easy because freedom is never completely easy. There are three things conscious silence communicates in a way no words can. The first is that you exist beyond your reactions. When you choose silence over reaction, you demonstrate to yourself and to others that you are not simply a collection of conditioned reflexes. You are something more. You have depth. And this depth doesn't need to be proven through eloquence or brilliant argumentation. It reveals itself precisely in the capacity of not needing to prove anything. The second thing conscious silence communicates is that the relationship matters more than immediate victory. In the relationships that matter most verbal battles aren't about the apparent subject. They're about recognition, about value, about security. And when you choose silence over escalating a conflict, you're implicitly saying, I care about what we have more than being right now. This doesn't mean capitulating. It means having perspective. The third thing, and perhaps the most profound, is that you have a different relationship with time than most people. Immediate reaction lives entirely in the present of the impulse. The silence that chooses to create space recognizes that there is a before and an after, that the consequences of the words you speak today can extend far beyond the moment they are uttered. Frankl wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that the last of human freedoms is the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. That sentence, written from his experience in the camps, has a particular resonance when we consider silence. Because choosing your attitude doesn't necessarily mean making a verbal statement about it. Often, the most powerful choice of attitude is expressed precisely in what you don't say, in the space you preserve, in the refusal to be completely determined by what the other person does. A prisoner in Auschwitz couldn't choose their physical circumstances, but they could. Within limits, Frankl was careful not to romanticize or exaggerate. Choose their inner stance toward those circumstances. And that choice, however small it might have seemed from the outside, was the difference between being completely consumed by the environment and preserving a core of identity that the environment couldn't touch. We apply this to contemporary life, and what do we find? That we live in an environment that constantly tries to turn us into reaction machines. Social media is designed by teams of behavioral engineers to maximize reactivity, to keep us in a state of emotional hyper-arousal that keeps us engaged and scrolling for the next hit of stimulation. The news is designed to provoke outrage because outrage grabs attention. Political conversations have polarized to a point where the most common stance is a knee-jerk reaction to the other side's position, with no real consideration for independent thought. In this context, the ability to pause, to not react automatically, to inhabit the space between stimulus and response, isn't just an interpersonal skill. It's a form of cultural resistance. It's an assertion that you are a thinking subject, not just a reacting object. Frankl saw the modern existential vacuum, this pervasive sense of meaninglessness manifesting as depression, anxiety, addiction, and a compulsive craving for stimulation, precisely as a result of losing touch with our capacity to author our own responses. When everyone reacts to everything in real time, when the speed of information and communication collapses the space between stimulus and response to near zero, we lose something fundamental, the possibility of being the cause of our actions rather than merely the effect of external forces. And silence, consciously practiced, is a way to reclaim that causality. To be, even for a moment, the origin point of something instead of simply a conduit for impulses coming from outside. There's something Frankl called self-transcendence that's deeply relevant here, and it goes beyond self-distancing. While self-distancing is the ability to observe yourself from the outside, self-transcendence is the human capacity to direct yourself towards something or someone beyond yourself. Frankl argued that deep psychological health doesn't come from focusing on yourself. It doesn't come from a self-help project centered on the ego, but from finding something worthwhile to act from. A cause, a loved one, a creative work, a value that transcends your immediate interests. And silence, in its deepest sense, can be an expression of self-transcendence. When you choose silence, not because you're protecting your ego, but because silence serves something greater than your ego, because preserving the relationship matters more than winning the argument, because the other person's well-being in that specific moment is more important than your own need to express yourself, you are practicing self-transcendence. You are being big enough to encompass not just yourself, but something beyond yourself. This isn't natural. It goes against the ego's tendency to defend itself, assert itself, and seek recognition. And it's precisely why it requires practice. Frankl never presented his insights as easy to implement. He was very honest about the difficulty of living by these principles. But he was also very clear about what's at stake, the difference between a life reacted to and a life chosen, between existing as an effect of external causes and existing as a subject responsible for your own being. And responsibility for Frankl is not a burden. It's a privilege. It's the highest expression of human dignity. You are responsible for your response. This means your response is yours, that it says something true about who you are, not just about what happened to you. Hit like on this video if you're starting to see silence in a different light, if something in this conversation is touching a truth you've always felt but never found expressed this way. This simple gesture helps more people find this content and perhaps find, through it, exactly what they're looking for without knowing they're looking. We now arrive at the most practical part of this conversation, and also the most demanding. How do we cultivate this conscious silence in real life, not as a superficial technique, but as a genuine expression of the noetic dimension, of the inner freedom that Frankl identified as the irreducible core of the human being? The first thing Frankl offers us is the creation of deliberate space for reflection before action. This might seem obvious, but it runs counter to powerful cultural and neurological tendencies. Culturally, we're in an environment that rewards quick responses as a sign of intelligence and readiness. Neurologically, our nervous system evolved for rapid responses to perceived threats, and interpersonal conflicts often activate the same circuits that would fire in the face of a real physical danger. Creating deliberate space means, concretely, practicing saying, "I need to think about this before I respond," instead of jumping in immediately. It means, in digital conversations, resisting the pressure for an instant reply and letting a message sit for an hour or a day before responding. It means, in face-to-face conflict situations, learning to breathe in a way that signals to your nervous system that there's no immediate danger, creating the physiological conditions for the noetic dimension to express itself. The second thing Frankl offers us is a criterion for silence, the question of meaning. Before responding, before reacting, you can ask yourself, what do I want this response to mean? Not what I want it to do, not what I want it to prove, but what I want it to express about who I am and what I value. This question, simple in its formulation, is profoundly guiding. It moves you from reactivity to intentionality. It doesn't say you should always stay silent, because sometimes the response you give after asking this question is a firm, clear, courageous one that needs to be delivered. But it ensures that when you speak from a place that is yours, that expresses something you've chosen to express, not something that was triggered in you by a mechanism the other person activated without your permission. The third thing is the practice of observing others' silence with new curiosity. When someone falls silent instead of reacting, our tendency is to interpret that silence immediately, usually in a way that confirms our fears. They're angry. They despise me. They have nothing to say. They've given up on me. Frankl invites us to consider the possibility that the other person's silence might be a space of freedom being exercised, not a void to be filled with our anxiety. This shift in perspective, learning to tolerate another's silence without needing to compulsively fill it, is itself an exercise in inner freedom that profoundly changes the quality of relationships. There's a scene Frankl described that stays with me whenever I think about these issues. In the concentration camps, there were moments of unexpected beauty. A sunset seen through the barbed wire, a bird landing on a fence, the silence of a dawn before the grueling work began again. And Frankl observed that the prisoners who could pause who could inhabit moments of beauty even amidst the horror, who could silence their despairing narratives long enough to simply watch the sunset. Those prisoners possessed a different kind of resilience, not because beauty changed their circumstances, but because the act of being present to something beautiful, the act of quieting the internal noise to let something external in, was itself an exercise in freedom. It was an assertion that they were more than prisoners, that they were human beings capable of contemplation, of appreciation, of presence. And no system, however brutal, could completely strip that capacity away, as long as there was a living human being to exercise it. That image to me feels like the heart of everything we've been discussing. Silence as power isn't a communication strategy. It's not a technique to win arguments or to appear more mysterious and interesting. It is the expression of a fundamentally human capacity that can be exercised even when everything else has been stripped away. It's the ability to inhabit the space between what happens to you and what you do with it. It's the choice renewed in every moment to be a subject rather than an object, a cause rather than an effect, a person living from the inside out rather than simply being shaped from the outside in. Viktor Frankl spent the latter years of his long life, he lived to be 92, championing an idea that feels increasingly radical as the world gets louder. That the meaning of life is not found in pleasure, not found in power, not found in the approval of others, but in the responsibility each person has to respond to what life is asking of them. And the response you give, both what you say and what you choose not to say, both the words you utter and the silences you inhabit with awareness and dignity, that response is you. It is the most authentic you can be. So let's return to that moment we described at the beginning. You're in a difficult conversation. Something has been said that stings, and you feel that internal pressure rising. The difference between the version of you that started this video and the version of you that has arrived here is that you now know there is a space. That space is your deepest freedom. That inhabiting that space is not weakness but is the highest expression of your humanity. That the silence you choose, when it is genuinely chosen and not imposed by fear or powerlessness, says more about who you are than any brilliant argument you could possibly formulate. Frankl taught us this, not with comfortable words from an academic armchair, but with his entire life, with the evidence that even in the worst that humanity has produced, inner freedom survived. And if it survived there, it can surely survive here, in the difficult conversations, in relational conflicts, in the digital noise that tries to turn us into 24-hour reaction machines. The question that remains, the question Frankl always invites us to ask, is not what can life give me, but what can I give to life? And sometimes, the most powerful thing you have to give is the silence that preserves the space where the best of you lives. If you've made it this far, if these ideas are resonating in a way that goes beyond the intellectual, if you feel we've touched on something you needed to hear, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. This is a space for people who take seriously the question of how to live, who aren't satisfied with easy answers to hard questions, who recognize that the search for meaning isn't a luxury, but a deeply human necessity. Let's continue this conversation together, video after video, week after week, exploring the thinking of Frankl and others who have faced the big questions of existence with courage and intellectual honesty. You don't have to take this journey alone. And please, share this video with someone you feel might need to find their own silence. Sometimes the most generous thing we can do is offer another person the words they needed to understand something they already felt.